So you will see on the final slide is actually my contact information. So let me just preface this by saying that that's there for a reason, and that goes for the people behind me as well. As those of you who've been on the committee already know, MASC is your state professional association. You do pay dues every year. Those of us who are on staff are there to serve as a resource for you, and that isn't only for the kinds of obvious things that you might think of, like the annual conference, or the other kinds of things. It also is for things where questions come up and you need answers of that kind, and also for these kinds of presentations. And not just this, but obviously we have other specialists on staff around policy and governance and those kinds of things. So do feel free to get in touch with us as necessary. Tonight, this is very, very focused specifically on the role of the school committee, specifically around budget. It does say budget and finance, and honestly there's probably more things that I could have added if we went into finance. But it seemed to me from where you're at that what you really need right now is a really solid grounding in the role of the school committee around budgeting. So that's what tonight is about. And it's entirely possible that we could talk more about some of the other responsibilities as necessary. For those of you who end up joining the committee, what part of your intake will be coming to a charting the course training, which is 6 hours, and that does include a broader budget and finance training. You guys should also realize that those are open to sitting school committee members at any time, and it's also not uncommon for school committee members to maybe drop in for a refresher of whatever part they're needing an update on. So we do those across the state. There'll be a few over the course of the fall. There is one in November at the annual conference, and then there'll be a series of them again in the spring. So keep that in mind as something that might be useful to you as well. In terms of the role of the school committee in finance, really the bedrock of what a school committee does in Massachusetts is in Chapter 71 of the Mass General Laws, which is the section that talks about school committees, and specifically Section 37. This is the sentence that I always reference when someone asks me, in Massachusetts, what does a school committee member do? And this is really the big three, which is the policies, appointing, evaluating, and firing superintendents, and approving budgets. And so you see that I've bolded reviewing and approving budgets for public education, because that is honestly, even literally, the central part of the topic here. And you'll see as we go through this that central sentence actually relates to the other two as well. There's a budgetary responsibility around evaluating the superintendent, and there's certainly budgetary responsibilities around establishing policies and tying them into goals. So those things are all intimately related. I should say, by the way, if at any point you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. I was an English teacher before I did this, so being interrupted is not, I'm also a mother of 3, so being interrupted is not uncommon for me. I'm going to give you a couple of big concepts tonight that the rest of what you do kind of falls under. And I think it's important for school committees to realize that when they are fulfilling their budgetary responsibility, you are actually serving as the mode of public transparency. So you're spending public dollars on a public good. You're spending public tax dollars from both the state and local, and even the federal government in some cases, on the public good of public education. And that needs to happen in a public way. So that's why when we talk about what needs to be done in an open session versus an executive session, when you do something like complete your negotiations, the contract has to be voted in open session. When you finish negotiating with the superintendent, that has to be done in open session. And of course, budgets have to be done in open session. And that's because you're spending public money, and because the public has an interest in where their dollars go, and also because ultimately what you're attempting to do is provide for a public good and public education. So really both halves of the equation require that. I think that sometimes it can feel as though you have all of this stuff that you have to do and it just becomes pro forma. And if you can think of it instead that you're essentially kind of serving as the window that allows the public to see how money is being spent and where the money is going, that's actually a really, that's I would say, really your role as the school committee when it comes to budgeting and when it comes to budgeting over the course of the year. So what does that end up looking like? Well, when it comes to budgeting, everybody immediately thinks of how much is being spent, right? We think of whatever that big number is that shows up in the headlines in the paper, or that shows up somewhere in the paragraphs. But it's not just how much is being spent, it's how much is being spent on what. And that's why when I talk to districts about budgets, that's one of the presentations that we'll do, for example, at the joint conference, is sort of best practices in budgeting. And one of the things that I always emphasize is that there are school districts that are very accustomed to getting essentially a munis printout as their budget. And my answer to that always is that doesn't tell me anything. And this is actually part of my job. My full-time job is actually looking at budgets. If you give me a munis printout, what you've given me is a list of account numbers and a list of dollar amounts. That doesn't really tell me what you spent money on. That doesn't tell me how many elementary school teachers you have, or if you're buying new Chromebooks, or how much money, like how many buses you're running, or anything like that. I was talking earlier, I presented yesterday to the school business officials, and I said one of the things that school committees really need is they need concrete representations of what their budget is. So it isn't dollars, it's how many kids are in elementary school classes, it's how many teachers do you have, it's what temperature is the school on a day when it's 90. But those kinds of pieces of information are in many cases things that you should be able to glean from the budget. And as you all know, they're also the answers to many of the questions that you probably get asked as you go through your days. So that's part of what you should be expecting to see as you work with your administration around your budget. And those are the kinds of questions that you should feel comfortable asking as you're doing that. Other information?
Just for people that don't know, munis?
Absolutely.
Munis?
The magic word.
Yeah.
Munis is sort of this mystical system that is used by public entities in managing their budgets. So it's used by towns, it's used by public school systems. Not used by all, but it's used by many. And thus it's something that budget offices and business offices are very comfortable with. It's kind of the universe they tend to live in. Mm-hmm. And it's fairly opaque to anyone who isn't sort of steeped in that.
Yep.
So for us, that would be budget.
Munis, it's an abbreviation, capital M-U-N-I-S.
So what's it mean?
It's a municipal accounting software. Exactly. It's kind of like the Cadillac of software. It is produced by Infinite Visions, who produces our Budget Sense software. It just has more capabilities, a little more.
What do you use here? I should ask that.
We use Budget Sense, which is also an Infinite Visions
from
Tyler product.
Yes.
So same thing.
Right.
Different sized towns use different softwares depending on their needs.
And I shouldn't have used that as shorthand.
Budget Sense?
Budget Sense, which is an Infinite Visions Tyler product, who also produces Munis. So all these softwares are specifically produced for fund accounting for municipalities and regional school districts.
And it means that the regional school districts can kind of talk to the towns in terms of their finances and that kind of thing. The tripping point becomes when that is sort of the only budgetary presentation that anyone's getting, which does in some cases happen. And if that is what's happening, then you haven't necessarily gotten all the information that you need. So this is actually part of that same question, which is where is the money coming from, right? So obviously as a district, as a regional school district, you think in terms of how much is each town paying and how much is the state going to kick in. And in particular, how much is the state going to kick in through Chapter 70 versus regional transportation reimbursement. But also, what are you getting from different kinds of grants? Because grants are not just magic money, as much as people like to think of them that way. They're tied to particular kinds of things that you're required to do. So that should be something that you're familiar with as well in terms of your budget. And again, in all of this, I'm not saying that these are things that each of you should know off the top of your head. But as you're going through your budget, as you're adopting budgets, this should be part of your conversation. You should be able to talk as a district about how much of your budget is coming from different funding sources. And that's useful not only for you all and for the administration, but it's also useful when you're talking to your community, because there are limitations on what you can do with different kinds of funds, that you can't spend every kind of money on everything. And that is a helpful thing to have. And then this is really where it gets into things that people don't always think in terms of their budget, but also is absolutely what ties the school committee into the rest of their responsibilities, which is why are you spending this money this way? In many cases, we kind of get into the budget and we say, okay, well, this is what we did last year, and we're giving the teachers this much more, and the heat has gone up by this much more, and we know we're going to need, these many more kids, and that's kind of all we do. And really, what any of us, really not just MASC, but MASS and MASBO would say is, you should really be asking yourselves as a district where you're heading, and then that should be determining how you're spending your money. So that's why I say here about aligning with district goals. You really should be able to say, when you go through your budget, the reason that we're spending this money in this fashion is because we're trying to achieve this aim. And so if you are changing how you're spending money, maybe you're adding a reading program, maybe you're subtracting a program, how is it that is actually helping you pursue a district goal? To give you an example from Worcester, this won't necessarily fly here, but one of the ongoing debates we always have with the City Council is Worcester's a municipal district. We don't necessarily have to bus our high school students, not required to by Mass General Law. City Council always said that doesn't count towards net school spending. We shouldn't have to spend money on it. And we said that's great, except we want to actually educate the kids. And we know from lots of research that if you cut busing, you actually will cut attendance, and then the high school kids aren't there, and then you kill your graduation rate, and you're not actually educating your high school students. So there was a good argument for spending those millions of dollars on busing in order to pursue our district goal, which was to keep our graduation rate up and actually continue to educate high school students. So that's the kind of tie that you should be able to make, the kind of argument you should be able to make. And as you can see, in your case, it's going to be conversations you're having at town meeting and with FinComs, but the same kind of thing is something that you should be able to do as school committee members and as the administration around saying, here is why we're spending the money that we are. And that goes in both directions, not just we're spending this money, but we're choosing to move money from this place to a different place. We're choosing to stop spending money over here and instead spend money over here.
It's really hard for us to see that because we have one general fund, it's about $14 million,
yep.
A little more. Then we got 99 other funds. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. If I am, not by much, and we spend at least $1 million out of there. So, for instance, retiree health insurance, not met on our budget. And so how is this normally presented? Because we don't get anything meaningful except the general fund report.
So the general fund, first of all, you should be getting enough information in your general fund where you can say this is the amount that's going to teacher salaries and this is the amount that's going to utilities and those kinds of things. Usually, best practice, we say, is to have at least as much of a breakdown as DESE requires the district to report to them. So they require about 14 categories. I'm not telling you that their categories are magic.
I'm just saying we have stuff off budget. We have stuff
right.
off general fund,
yes.
$1 million or more.
And that, right, so that's actually where, and this is something that I know a lot of districts are still working on. I will tell you that you should have two things. One of the things that DOR always says is make sure that your towns are clear on what money isn't being passed as part of their budgets. So if you have revolving funds or E&D or that kind of thing, those are things that are under your control. They don't have anything to do with the town. They're not like up for them to dabble in, shall we say. Those are things that you would not necessarily make part of your presentation when you go to town meeting. But when you're here having your conversations, yes, those absolutely should be part of what you're seeing. You should know how much you have. You should know where it's coming from, what the trends has been. And then whatever the proposal is for what you're spending it on, because that's actually under your purview as well in terms of voting it. That's again, tied to district goals or that kind of thing, so that you actually can not only know that you're voting and what you're voting, but why you're voting it. So yes, if that's a whole, yes. And we should always say that I acknowledge that you are new here, yes. So no one is saying that.
And I definitely realize the way things are done in the past, but I actually spoke with Tracy yesterday, and one of the things in rebuilding our budget book and our budget process is going to be each school will have their own budget. It will roll up into a main budget, but within those individual school budgets or even our district and our shared budgets, there will be tabs for each individual account with what the intent is of those expenditures. And I actually do have a question related to these, because we essentially use school choice money to offset our health insurance expense. So when we were trying to revise this budget and trying to provide transparency, up until, the 12th hour, I actually provided, 2 lines for health and life, and I said it was 3,200,000 whatever it was, and then the 879,000 offset, so the community could see that.
Yep.
But what I'm thinking, obviously, is, present that in those individual spreadsheets. This is our full cost.
Yep.
This is offset sources that are going to fund this, and this is what's flowing through the general budget.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that's what best practice would be, because
Yes.
you can't really have that in the general fund showing, but at least that provides that transparency, so people know these are our true expenses and this is where they're being funded from before we tap into the town and the state funds.
Yes, and I will say that it always is, it can be a little bit of a challenge in regional districts, because you want to make sure that everybody has as much information as possible.
Yep.
You also don't want to give anybody at town meeting the impression that they can vote on what you do with your school choice funds. So you want to make sure that they understand, and that they're clear that you do have offsets that you as a committee and administration are choosing to use, while at the same time keeping everybody under their own purviews, because that's important.
And I think one of the things
sounds good to me, though, in
that
terms of what
is
you're doing.
done right so far is in the salaries we do, and I don't know that this information has been given to the school committee in the past or what information they've had, but we do have, what their salary is, and then there's offsets and what actually hits the budget. So in that offset would be any monies that come from grants, other state funds, early childhood tuition, those types of things. So I think if we can extrapolate that into the rest of our expenditures that might be covered, that will provide some of that transparency in this new year.
Actually, answer your question, which is doing exactly that.
I kind of shared that just to understand kind of the scope of the problem with this committee getting its arms around the situation. And Tanya understands where we want to go.
Yes.
Which is good.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, that's,
So I was kind of wondering, we may be somewhat unique in that we have net choice revenue. It used to be a lot more, and our funding sources are a little different. But it meant a very obscured budget picture for anybody looking at it.
right, and I think that, as Tanya probably knows from her meeting with some of her peers across the state, you are kind of in a group of peer communities where you balance your budget on school choice. I mean, that's, you're in that region, but also then it extends out to the Berkshires. But yes, and then for the rest of the state, they wouldn't have any idea what you're talking about. So yes, you're right. That's sort of a particular class of school committees that are doing it that way. And I think that it is important not only just in terms of budgetary transparency, but also, to your point, that it is a income source that fluctuates, and I know that you've obviously had an enormous experience with that, but that is something to always be aware of, that you can depend on your Chapter 70 and that kind of thing, but school choice is not as stable. Yep.
Excuse me, I would love to have Tracy be the only speaker when she's talking. I think it's a little rude of us to be talking among ourselves to each other. Thank you.
Are we good there? Okay. So, and as I was saying, as I come across things, stop me. So this, for those of you who may end up coming to charting the course, this will become a familiar slide. And the first and most important thing that you need to take away from this is everybody thinks of school budgets in terms of the spring, right? Because that's when everything is happening and we're having all these meetings and we're having all these votes and hearings and everything else. This past year, everybody was panicking because we kept having things canceled from snow. But just because it's past the school committee and it's past your town meetings, you're not done. You get to take a breath, but then you're not done. And obviously the business office is never done. But the budget for you all is really this sort of green square on the bottom right, which is deliberating and approving the budget and then submitting it to your appropriating authorities, which in your case is the town meetings. But the budget itself is actually a circle, and I actually tend to think of it not just as a circle but almost as a spring, because School business offices actually tend to live in about 3 fiscal years at the same time. So end of year reports are due September 30th. That would be last year's. We're currently living in FY19, so FY18 is being closed, FY19 is currently happening, and planning for FY20 is happening at the same time. And that's true of every school district in the state. So that's, first of all, not all school committees are aware that you kind of live in a 3-year zone. And in some cases, you're then also planning ahead for long-term projects. So that is something to be aware of. But also that each year influences the next. So what has been learned from 17, hopefully or what was learned from 18, hopefully influenced 19. As 19 is starting to come out, you're looking ahead to 20, and that should be influencing 20. So the superintendent and the administrators now are assessing needs and looking ahead. That may involve things like enrollment, may involve things like the requirements that are coming out from the state around civics and changes in history. It may include, technology changes, it may include building projects, whatever. Then eventually the superintendent will present the budget here. You will have your deliberation, eventually adopt a budget that you then submit to your appropriating authorities. Your final budget gets approved by the appropriating authorities. Now, I never put it on here, but then sometime after that, the state actually approves their budget. Sometimes it's not until the next fiscal year, but in any case, sometimes they do. And we all know that regardless of what kind of district you are, there's some kind of influence. If you're, my home district of Worcester, you're wondering what the Chapter 78 is looking like. For districts like yours, you're really wondering what the regional transportation reimbursement is going to look like. And then your budget is implemented and monitored. But at the same time that that's happening, you're already starting the next year and you're closing the previous year. So I think it's important for you to realize that your role never ends, and we'll talk more about that in a second, but also that your administration is living in kind of a triple reality as they're doing things. And that can be very useful to you as you're asking them to look ahead, but also as you're having them look back and say, what are the lessons learned here? What do we know from before? So here's your next big idea, which is being a check and balance. If you do think of the school committee in terms of that once a year you put your hand up in the air and it goes to the town meeting and then you're done, you don't really operate as a check and balance. And one of the things that I try to emphasize to school committees is that finance for school districts is really a shared responsibility. So the day-to-day responsibility resides with the superintendent, resides with the budget office and the business manager, but there are pieces of this that belong to you. So obviously every time you sign a warrant, there's a check and balance happening. But there's a number of other functions that you have and that you do where you essentially are checking and balancing each other. This is not, as much as it can sound like, this is nobody trusting anyone. I would argue that it's actually exactly the opposite. This is that you've got each other's backs. Okay? This is that there's more than one set of eyes on this. This is that you actually are making sure that this functions. So that there isn't only one or two groups of people who are saying, have we included everything that we need to? Are we fulfilling the responsibilities that we said we were going to? Are we, the commitments that we've made, are we actually doing that? Are we achieving the kinds of things that we plan to? We have those conversations a lot around accountability, right? We talk about that with test scores and with MCAS and that kind of thing. We don't always talk about it in terms of money. And that's another place to have those kinds of conversations and make sure that you have each other's backs. So one of the questions that I urge you to really explore and answer, to know answers to is, we've got these numbers in front of us. Where did these numbers come from? Okay, and that may seem like a silly question, but it's a really valuable question to know as a school committee member. There are projections that are made by your business office, by your superintendent. They're getting those numbers from somewhere. Where are they coming from? How dependable are they? What kind of systems are they using? So here are some questions that you should be familiar with. And again, no one is expecting the school committee to run their own projections. I would never advise you to do that. I'm actually being trained as a school business manager now. You don't want to run your projections, believe me. Way too much work. You hire experts for that. But you should have some familiarity of where the numbers come from. Okay, so why are we using this percentage for health insurance? What are the assumptions we're making when we talk about settling the teacher's contract? What kinds of assumptions are we making about our spending on utilities? Are we basing our projection on transportation reimbursement on past practice and what we might actually be hearing from the state? Jay Sullivan comes every 2 months and gives little tidbits and hints. We can hope that he's got good information. But those are some things that you should actually know, because that's going to give you a better idea of what you can say to your towns and to your communities. But it also means that all of you are on firmer ground, because all of you are in the same level of knowledge in terms of, well, we looked at the past 5 years and here's what the trend lines have tended to be. We've talked to people across the state and here's where the numbers have tended to be. But those are good things for you to know and ask. That's why I say, does this align with past history, and does this align with changes we know are coming? If you know you're going to have to add bus routes, that should be included in your projection for transportation. If you know you're going to be, if you're projecting shrinking numbers for particular grade levels or those kinds of things, that should be included in your calculations. So these kinds of questions, again, not to run the projections yourself, but to know what they're based on is actually part of your job. And that's one of the things that I think is really important for school committee members to know. This is, of course, always a dangerous thing to say to school committee members, because some of them think then they should go out and take notes on how many ballpoint pens are being used, or that kind of thing. This is not telling you to do that. Okay, this is not to harass your superintendent with those kinds of questions. But where are our numbers coming from, and essentially how can I then go and defend these before town meeting? What are we basing these on? Given what we know about the past and what we know about what's coming, are we making good projections here? Those are entirely reasonable questions to ask. Here's some of the places that should come up. So first of all, everybody thinks a budget deliberation, right? You're sitting here, you've got your numbers, you're going to actually have those kinds of conversations. But as I said, that's not the only place that those conversations should happen. One of the things that always freaks me out when I go to a school committee meeting and I'm later on the agenda is I'll be sitting in the office and I'll see this binder come out and it gets passed down the table and they're having a meeting at the same time, right? And I know it's the warrants, right? Because everybody's signing them. And you can tell that no one has actually seen them and no one knows what they're signing. And I have no idea how you do it. I just know that I see this various places. The thing about warrants is you should have some idea of what you're signing. I go back to my dad's a CPA. He always told me you don't sign something unless you've read it and understand it. I'm not telling you that you should sit at a meeting and read them and understand it, but different districts have different processes for warrants. Some have people come in ahead of time and review them. Some have electronic signing processes. Some just have electronic review processes and then people sign in the meeting. But there are different ways of handling this that don't impede the flow, because I know that at the end of the day you guys have got to pay your bills, so we got to make sure that happens too. But you also should have some degree of knowledge about what you're signing. And there are best practices around presentations of warrants too. And again, I'm saying this not having looked at your warrants, I actually don't know that. But there are places where school committee members kind of panic because they're getting numbers that they're signing without getting a lot of information. This doesn't have to be a big job, but again, that's something to be considering. Quarterly reports, yes.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Of course.
What have you seen as far as best practice across the state for that? I know we give the information, I shouldn't say we, our financial clerk, accounts payable, Brenda, emails that information out a week ahead of time.
Excellent.
I don't know what is kind of the consensus across the state, what the school committees like to see.
So this always sounds like I'm not actually answering the question, but when you deal with as many different committees as we do, it becomes the default, which is whatever works for the committee. There are places where people can't physically get in to sign the warrants on a regular basis that have moved to electronic signatures. What I always say is, as long as the school committee members who are responsible for signing feel like they have had enough opportunity to review it, and if they had questions about anything, to do that. And again, in this case, really all you're trying to do is make sure that you're spending money in ways that you said you were going to. So are your warrants actually matching up with your district goals? That's really all I would say. So if it's that you're mailing them out ahead of time, I mean, obviously they're warrants, they're public documents, and then people are signing after they've had that lapse of time, then I would say that you're fulfilling the responsibility, as long as the committee feels like they've got enough, what they need.
So we pass around a signature sheet in a one-page truncation of select boards and such, they actually see, they have the warrant, they can say, wonder what this $40,000.03 is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a better internal control than working off of a report generated by Budget Sense that we don't actually know.
Well,
is
right,
the
so
warrant we
that's,
just signed.
right, so that's why I say there's also, half of the best practice is also how are the warrants presented. So different districts will do this different ways. I think we actually have examples online because we've actually done presentations around this in the past with MASBO. That actually sort of say, you know, you get an abbreviated version of, you know, it's coming out of this account. It is for this particular thing. So you get a sentence or two of actually what it is the money went towards. And in some cases that then means that you can go back and refer to whatever it was that you voted in terms of the budget.
Is it a best practice to actually physically have the warrant in the room with the people that are being asked to sign it?
That's,
I know they're kind of precious. You don't want to lose them or you're in big trouble.
right, I mean, most places I know actually are keeping it kind of all together anyway. So they're reviewing something and signing something and it's, the legal documentation is actually there. The thing that I would most be concerned about is that whether it's a paper thing or an electronic thing, that you've had a chance to read something that means something, and that before you sign. And again, that may be an electronic thing. And I mean, obviously, school committee members are all over the map in terms of how happy they are with electronic communication. I know we have members who still don't have emails, but versus other kinds of communication. I will say that for warrants, particularly, I mean, because you're paying the bills and time is of the essence, that electronic communication can be useful to make sure that that sorting out happens before the actual signature does, unless someone is doing it during other times, because there also are committees where people come in during other times and actually do the warrant signing then.
I have a question actually for Tanya.
Oh yes,
That's okay.
it's fine with me.
Can we get the warrants electronically before the meeting?
So you guys do get them electronically a week before the meeting that has every account, what the vendor is being paid for. There's always a memo in there that says what it's for. But one of the things that I believe Brenda has, well, the warrant itself is like this,
that's what
and
I'm talking about,
but
yeah.
each sheet is every vendor.
Yeah,
So if we
yeah.
do 200 checks, you're looking at a 200-page document. What you guys get is, this is the account, these are the vendors we paid out of those accounts, what the memo of what it's for. All those individual sheets is that, but it's
Add
a
up
page
to
by
those.
page, and it's not the actual invoices. One of the things I know when I worked at another small town in Massachusetts temporarily is they would have a accordion file with all the invoices, a copy of the warrant, the copy that you get, because to have someone look
Right,
through 200
no.
pages, like I did that as a treasurer when I was the treasurer here, to match up the checks, make sure we're paying the right vendor, the amounts are right. That's something that treasurer does to verify that the checks actually match the warrant.
Right.
But the summarized version you get with the vendor information and all that along with the copies of the invoice is something that I think we could make available to the school committee
That's what I'd like,
from when
yeah.
they email, and then you guys could come to Brenda's office and that would be available. That's something I think, you know, and I think she does keep that out until the warrant is actually approved. But if there was a different place besides her office you wanted to look at that, like John's office or whatever, I think that could be
So we'd
accommodated.
have to come in to look at it, they can't electronically because
It's all the
cumbersome?
it'd be
Yeah.
all the invoices, so if
Got
you
it.
wanted us to scan 300 invoices
that
plus,
doesn't
it
seem like-
kinda
no,
gets.
that doesn't seem like
so
a good
it's-
use of
Yeah,
time.
so it would just be available,
Right, so
I
there
think.
probably is a way of compiling that information
Yeah.
such that you end up with the
Right.
information without
Thank
the
you.
scanning. Yes.
So when I first came on, I was really uncomfortable with the warrant signing because I didn't understand the link between the electronic documents I got sent and the warrant I was signing.
Mm-hmm.
So I went in and met with Brenda, and she was very good at explaining to me how to match the document I was looking at to the warrant. And I just think probably we should do that for every new school committee member, so that
Yes.
you
Yep.
can
Have Brenda come
actually
to a
orient
meeting,
yourself to all the documents
Mm-hmm.
and
I'll
know
go at once.
when and how to ask a question. You sort of learn what the funding codes are, what the numbers mean on the page.
Yep.
And it's so implicit to the people that work with it all the time.
Yes.
It's like the forest and the trees, right? But as a new member, it's pretty scary to have the warrant come around.
And we're gonna have a new chart of accounts next year that's compliant with
Right.
UMass, so that will be a whole new thing.
So even the forest is changing.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I got to the point where I could go through the electronic document, I could see what account it was, I could see how much was encumbered, I could see if we were still within the encumbered amount, I could see what it was for, I could ask questions. I didn't always get good answers to my questions from our previous superintendent, but I think going forward, the whole process will probably be much more transparent and clearer. But I do think we do kind of have that once you know how to orient the documents.
And I think that you're also creating a valuable suggestion there moving forward, which is what do you do with new school committee members? Because I think that's one of the, we can do state level orientation,
Right.
But what are the kinds of things that new school committee members need in order to effectively be members of this committee?
Yeah.
You've just started at least one of those questions. So that's a really valuable thing to have. Quarterly reports is a best practice, and the quarterly reports I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute, but the intent here is that it isn't that you pass the budget and then you kind of find out how you did at the end, right? This isn't that kind of thing. That's not a good way of doing things. But that quarterly check-in of where are the accounts? Are things happening as we thought they were going to be? What was a big surprise? Did we get to the third quarter and discover that we had a lot of snow this winter and suddenly we have to move money into a facilities account from somewhere? That's an easy answer, but there are also other things that happen during the year where things have to be moved and they have to be voted because budgetary transfer authority per DOR ruling is still something that resides with the school committee. So some districts also do monthly reports. That can be a little cumbersome depending on your business office. Some of them just run them as a matter of course point of information. But having some procedure where you have a check-in that says, here's where we are, here's where we're going, here's where we're at. But I'll talk more about that in a second.
So you're going to talk all about quarterly reports?
I will.
And how we are, okay.
Yep. This is actually just all intended in sort of places you would be asking questions. So reviewing audit findings. I'm a little surprised when there are school committees that don't actually, you are supposed to get them. That is actually part of it. And having a procedure for saying, here's what was found, and having the administration respond. Like, this is why those findings happened, here's what we're doing with them, or here's what we're not doing with them, and having a way forward. Because that, again, is obviously directly tied into the rest of your budget. Policy setting, there is a whole section of your policy that has to do with financial policy. All of that, I've heard a school business manager refer to that as protecting the honest, right? We assume that everyone is honest, and if we are following our policies and procedures correctly, we have those to defend us. But policy setting is intimately tied to budgetary setting. And then superintendent evaluation, which kind of an important point here is actually an indicator. There is an indicator within the superintendent evaluation. 2E is fiscal systems. So if you talk to us about superintendent evaluation, we will remind you that you don't have to use emphasize every indicator every year. If you are taking recommendations, mine would be that this would be a really good year for you to be looking at 2E. So again, ultimately, the responsibility of fiscal systems in terms of data management does live with the superintendent, although obviously it gets largely done by other people. But this is really something that you should consider, again, one of those where your middle responsibility ties into your other responsibility of evaluating the superintendent. And you'll see, Proficient is developing a budget that aligns with the district's visions, missions, and goals. So it's not just that we spent the money, but how does it actually talk about where we're going? And allocates and manages expenditures consistent with the district's goals and available resources. Available resources obviously is a really important point here. So we always tell our new school committee members that they have a fiduciary responsibility as school committee members. There is actually you have a legal responsibility as school committee members for your district. And that means that you have to understand some of the basics of what does it mean to be a school committee member and how do school budgets work. So a couple of things, we've talked a little bit about this already, but I'm always a little scared when people don't know what they're signing on warrants. So knowing what you're signing when you sign a warrant is part of operating under your fiduciary responsibility. And then in terms of quarterly financial reporting, this is another place where I will talk to you about past history and projections. So quarterly reporting is, what has it been like for us about March in terms of what we've been spending on electricity and heat by that point? Are we heading for the same direction given what we know from the past? Or are we not actually in line with that? And if so, what does that mean for the rest of our budget? Those are questions that you should be able to ask, that your administration should be able to respond to. And then where are we going? Given what we know of what's left of the year, and given what we know about what's left of what kind of changes may be happening over the rest of the year, do we have enough money in the accounts to actually fulfill our responsibilities? For some things that's going to be pretty straightforward and simple, right? Because the same expense repeats the same way every month. When it comes to things like staffing, we know that those change over the course of the year. Those are things that you need to be prepared for. And again, this isn't meant to trip anyone up. Actually, on the contrary, it's meant to mean that you don't get to April and discover that you don't have enough money, or that money is in the weird places, in the wrong places, it's not in helpful places. And also, again, this is going to be useful for you as you move from one year to the next. Yeah. I know sometimes I'm a little too accurate, right? I do read your news coverage.
Trauma victims. We are.
But this also then should be able, and I know that you're already doing some of this, be able to say, this is what happened last year over the course of the year. What does that tell us about what this year then ends up looking like, and what our spending patterns are, and what kinds of things tend to happen over the course of the year? Some of those things are true for all districts, right? I mean, obviously our heating bills go up in the wintertime. If you have schools that have AC, our electric bills go up when it's cold, when it's warm. But there are also other things that are unforeseeable. If you have somebody new come in who has an out-of-district special education tuition, suddenly you have an expense that you weren't necessarily planning for. And that's, again, another one where having those quarterly check-ins can be very valuable. And I say this particularly for districts like yours, where you have multiple towns that have town meetings, and you're talking about budgets that are of a size where having a single tuition move in can make a huge sizable difference. Having something like a quarterly budget report where whether you're doing it as a full committee or you're doing it with a smaller subcommittee, that's in a posted public session with posted minutes and posted reports, can be really useful when you then have to have conversations with the FinComs and the town meetings about why your special education line is different this year than last year. Because we had somebody move in February, and this is what happened. So, I mean, I've even seen, there are different ways that different districts are handling it, where they're setting up funds for it or that kind of thing. But even if you're not doing anything like that, just simply having a process where that kind of reporting and conversation is happening in public is really invaluable when it comes to continuing that level of trust with your funders, essentially. So I'd really recommend that. Also one of those where you can talk about circuit breaker. Yes?
So I have a quick question for you, because unfortunately, and the school committee can vouch for this, looking back at our history right now for the last 2 and 3 years isn't super valuable, unfortunately. So last year, expenses were frozen because we found out, I shouldn't say we, I wasn't here, but the district found out that the transportation was over budgeted significantly, so to make up for that, the expenditures were frozen. So I think this year particularly, and this is just kind of a note, that meeting with the principals and really understanding, okay, what are your real needs? Because when we look back at FY18 expenditures and we say we only spent $900 of a $2,500 budget, that looks great, but the budget was froze and people couldn't spend on what they needed. So what that does is then it inflates what we need the next year because we didn't meet the services the prior year. So I think there's something for the school committee and the public in general to keep in mind as we go into FY20 for the next year's budget. But how do districts handle the budgeting when that has happened? Is there a certain look back period that you recommend? Do we go back 5 or 6 years and see how things were operating, with similar enrollments, or?
So I think there's probably a couple of things you can do. I think in terms of, more transparency is always good. So in terms of sort of even just moving forward, if you can bring a realistic list of needs to the school committee and have that conversation publicly, not and make this clear to the principals that you're actually going to fund it all.
Right.
But that people should acknowledge that you probably have 2 years of needs now.
Yep.
And that needs a plan. In terms of you then sort of going back and saying, we can't necessarily learn from our own direct past, use similar kinds of resources. So, throw it out over the Masville listserv.
Yep.
What did people in northern Worcester County spend on, these kinds of things for these kinds of things? In some cases, maybe you can recreate some of those expenditures. And yeah, if there are ones where maybe the last 2 years aren't useful, but going back further is, if you assume a reasonable rate of inflation, does that help you?
Right.
And again, those are the kinds of things that you all should then know going forward is, okay, well, we don't have great information for the last couple of years. Here are the baseline things we're putting into our projections, and we're going to see how those play out. And then you have those conversations with the committee of, okay, so we're finding out that this one was accurate, this one wasn't, and we're going to need to make adjustments as needed.
Because we actually are doing, I'm sure you know, with Mark Abrams and Steve Hemmons, the baseline projections and some of this work now.
Yep.
And they are using the revised FY19 as our baseline, and I think that will be a good tool for the school committee. Once FY19 is actually like 6 months in, you look at, okay, where are we at 6 months? How have these numbers kind of changed, and use that for the true projections? Because we've looked at things across different districts. How much is electricity really going up? What does insurance really look like? Can we expect 2.5% increases average across contracts? Those kind of things. So I was just curious if that.
Yeah, no,
was
it sounds to me as though you're using best practice there.
Okay.
And again, this is just something for the school committee to always sort of constantly be aware of. Is there's kind of this hole where there shouldn't be for your budget office, and they're going to do the best they can to bridge over it. But it is a bridge. It's not solid ground.
So I was just showing people a little bit larger version of.
Oh, sure. Sorry about that. Yes, that's true. You can't read it in the thing, can you?
So
Yes.
if anybody wants to look at the larger.
Yes, and I mean you can find those on. You can find the full thing online.
Yeah, we sent the
On
link to the
Jesse's,
whole
which
school
is-
committee.
Oh, good.
Yeah, to this rubric.
Jesse's website is very hard to follow.
It is. Well, if you get stuck, I mean, I know you sent it out already, but if you get stuck on that kind of thing, let me know. So then in terms of audits, the conversation that the school committee should have around audits is not, again, to sort of go back and recreate the audit or what have you, but really there's kind of a 3-part questioning that should happen with audits, which is what was the audit finding, and then the administration response, and then was the administration's response sufficient? Did it actually meet whatever the needs were of the audit? So something to be aware of is, I mean, there's different kinds of audits. Are you actually, holding up to the standards of what you're supposed to with your grants? But there also are audits where they come in and actually make sure that essentially you're doing what you say you're doing with your money. When those kinds of findings come back to the administration has obviously already had a conversation with the auditors anyway. But then you're having that conversation with the administration around the relative legitimacy of the findings, what any kind of dollar impact there was, and then what their plans are going forward falls very much under your fiduciary responsibility. Okay, so that's it's really another place where you have each other's backs, right? They're making this finding on the school district, they're not making that finding on the administration. So it's up to you to sort of hold up your end of supporting the administration in fixing what needs fixing on that, and doing what needs doing on that.
Can I ask a question before?
Absolutely.
Because, if you're new to the school committee, which I have been, you get into a meeting with auditors presenting their report.
Yep.
You're kind of deep into the weeds right away because they're going into detail on financial matters that you're not necessarily familiar
And some
with.
auditors are not good at talking to school committees.
Right.
Yes.
And then the whole question of did it work? Like,
Yeah, we
I'm
need
not
an
a
interpreter.
financial person, right?
So I think that you
knowing
have-
whether it
yes.
worked is
Yep.
kind of a how in the hell am I supposed
So
to
you're not going to know. There should really kind of almost be a space between the blue and the last it's pink here, but the last purple here, which is that you're not necessarily going to know right away that it worked. That may be something where you don't know till the next audit comes back,
Kind of scary.
which is kind of scary.
It's really uncomfortable.
What's even scarier though is if you get an audit finding and the school committee doesn't even know and things just keep getting worse. And that happens.
Yeah.
So,
It does.
yes.
Yeah, it does.
Yes.
It does, it did.
So,
Yes.
real quick with the audits, because I'm very familiar with working with the auditors, one of the things that we are working on is getting our audits sooner. Because the timing of the audits has been super late, which has really made any improvements that have been done in response to that management letter like a 2-year lookout. Because one, right now, we don't have FY17 because pending legislation won't allow them to issue it. But one of the things I will say, because even only as treasurer, I worked very closely with the auditors this year because of the situation we were in, and they're going to be very clear in their management letter, even if there are findings, what is already being done to remedy that, or what has already been done, and if it's already been fixed at the time of the audit, but it wasn't right in FY17.
Yes.
Because I said I think it's really important for the school committee and the communities to understand that yes, this was done wrong, but we've already done these things
Differently.
rather than waiting 2 years
No,
for it
that's
to come
important.
off the management letter. So that information I'm hoping will be clear in the audit that comes out. And the same as FY18, because as much as we wanted it earlier, we're still looking at January, February. So not the best, as long as we have, you really want 6 months in a year to be able to remedy anything in the management letter. Because it takes a while to get new policies and procedures put in place if that's what needs to happen. So I just wanted to let you guys know that in addition to your management letter notes this year, there should be additional information as far as what's being done.
Okay.
So it kind of helps that, what's the response part
Yes.
before waiting out, a year and a half or 2 years to see if it's actually fixed.
And again, honestly, in some ways, like the warrants, this is another one where you should, you obviously are supposed to get your backup for your agenda ahead of time anyway, but having whatever the audit written report is ahead of time, so you can read it on your own, and then be able to bounce questions off what things mean, it is important. That
I
is a
remember
useful
getting
thing.
that letter and thinking, oh my God. I
The
don't know how to
auditors,
do
the
that.
auditors should be presenting a draft report in like 2 weeks in advance of actually presenting to the school committee or your board of selectmen. That I think is kind of a best practice. They'll say, when would you like us to come present? Because they want to make sure the committees have enough time to look at it, not here's the report we're presenting, what are your questions? So I think that will definitely happen.
And if you
too.
get stuck again, remember those are the kinds of things you can call us on too. We're
Right,
saying,
because
we got this letter,
Yeah.
first of all, the first question every school committee member has is, should we be panicking?
Right.
Right? Because
Right.
it's like the auditors, and auditors are scary.
Ours was
You
how
don't
long
even,
should we
exactly, like, right, and they wrote a whole bunch of stuff, and I don't understand it.
Being able to ask questions not in public at a school committee meeting is really helpful.
And I think we actually talked about this yesterday. There's so much work that the school committees do outside of the meeting, and a lot of it in our district, I think, is guilty of it. We try to do all of our work in the school committee meetings, which makes them 3 and 4 hours long. But being able to have these reports ahead of time, have the warrants ahead of time, and having the school committee emailing or coming into our office, asking us these questions, getting clarification, so when they come to the school committee and they ask the question or the information is presented, the school committee can actually answer the questions that the community has because they've
Yes.
already addressed it with the administration.
Exactly, and that's really the best way of thinking about it too, is that the meeting then should be something where you're ensuring that everybody else gets it. Because you've already had your chance to kind of absorb it. That's a really valuable way of thinking about it.
That's a thing that, because there's so much information is passed along to us electronically before the meeting, if we all made a point to read that before we get to the meeting, and then we're not here for 4 hours.
Do your homework.
The new people.
Absolutely. Yep, do your homework, that's right.
Bring your sleeping bags, new people.
I do think we need a lot of help in understanding the auditors. I've got 11 years of recent municipal experience and 10 years of nonprofit management and scores of years on nonprofit public schools in fund accounting, and I still, in some cases it was months later that I had an epiphany of what they were saying. Just things as simple as going concern. We were going to get we probably did get a going concern, but in common parlance, that means you've got a business that's, So they told us, you haven't what did they say? We haven't reconciled our cash.
Yeah.
And so I say, how can you possibly have just completed an audit then? Oh, well, we have other ways around it. I ought to be able to understand them, but I don't. And I don't think I'm the only one.
No.
And there's so much, first of all, I think you get overwhelmed when you just see the thickness of their report. And then there's so much information in there. It's hard sometimes to decipher what is a priority, where the priorities
Well,
are.
then there's so much disclaimer language that
Sure,
to wade
because what are they
through
looking
that
for
just
and not, yep, that's true.
basically
mean-
might cause you to conclude it's worthless.
I think the management letter is really the school committee or a board of selectmen's go-to.
Yes.
And those are actually, the way that those are presented, just for information, is the most important things that need to be like fixed now are up front. And the things that are just comments or things that recommendations for best practice purposes are usually towards the end. So your first few pages are your most important, and then at the end it's like, okay, and this is going on too, but it's being remedied or whatever. So they are listed in order of importance and, compliance with the law and those kind of things. And that's just part of how standard audits are done.
Are we done with budget process? Are we talking about budget monitoring now?
We're talking about fiduciary responsibility. We're never really done with budget, but yes.
I was just hoping to learn a little more about the budgeting process. It's September. What should we be doing right now about next year's budget?
I would defer to your administration because the cycle shifts depending on the district. Most districts
Best
that have a
practice.
cycle like yours are in, for the administration side, they are in the process now of starting to think about the next year, of saying what are the needs, as you just were hearing, what are the needs we didn't meet last year. Starting to be planning ahead first of all, they should have a budget calendar set of when they're going to do what. Starting to have the school level conversations and the district level conversations about what the changes are that are going to be needing to be happening. Most superintendents are doing things like asking questions like, do we have to update the history curriculum or the social studies curriculum? Does the new accountability system mean that we need to pay more attention to dropouts or to chronic attendance, chronic absenteeism? Those kinds of questions are what the administration should be doing at this point. It often is a little bit before you necessarily hear anything. Though your part of that is honestly, where is the district going? Because those two things should actually be interlinked. Your district goals, your superintendent's goals should be determining the prioritization of what's going on with the budget. So there's stuff that's going to come from DESE, so we all know that what DESE says, DESE gets, so that stuff has to happen too. But if the district's priority is to expand foreign language or to ensure every student has whatever, those are the kinds of things that should be really clear, so that when the superintendent is having the conversations with principals internally at this point, those are actually part of the conversation too, because the principal then can be saying, well, the district priorities are this, here are the things that I don't have, or the kinds of things we're going to need to implement or change in order to actually meet those goals. So I'd say the goal setting probably is where you're at this point. Having some idea of, that's why MASC sends out updates around accountability and around changes in standards and that kind of stuff, so that you can kind of see those things coming, right? You should expect that someone's going to have a conversation with you at some point about civics and those kinds of things, because that's going to be coming. It may not be this budget, but that's coming in terms of budget.
So at that point, are we blue skying? Are we to suspend disbelief and talk about our needs and our wants? Because at the same time, this, to me, and I'm the budget committee chairman currently, this feels like a relatively meaningless planning activity unless it comes down to really, really hard priority choices and using that process for that. Our existence is in question. We laid off more than 10 people coming into this year, and we laid off more than 11 coming into last year, and we had 34 kids in our 9th grade class signed up. I don't know how many we ended up with. So, I mean, we're kind of in a survival mode, and I wonder how much emphasis to put on that besides finding a new way forward that's survivable. So, what I learned, some of us reached out to an area school, and their business manager and superintendent said, you start your budget for next year in September, and it starts with a comprehensive calendar.
Right, so what is the, right.
I'd never heard of one until then.
Oh, okay, so it's one of those where the administration has it, whether or not the school committee is aware of it varies. But the school, the district, I mean, first of all, the end of the fiscal year is always going to be June 30th, right? So everything has to have happened by then. But when are your town meetings? When do they, either are they or when do they tend to be? If you then backtrack from that, when does that mean you have to be voting? When does that mean you have to have your budget hearing? So those kinds of things have already been laid out, certainly internally. So, if that's a conversation that you want to have with administration, we'd like to know when those dates are. That's certainly something some districts do. To your larger point, which I agree with, I think that I don't think that those two things are actually in conflict, though. What do we want for our 9th graders, and can we give it to them if they have a class of 34 or what have you? What does it look like to be this school district and have that number of kids and want X for our graduates? And you're obviously having difficult conversations around buildings and how many you're going to have and those kinds of things too. I would argue that that's the same conversation too, though, where in other districts, when they've had those conversations, part of the conversation has been, what are our highest values? What are our highest priorities? Are they having a school presence in particular locations? Is it what the offerings are that we can give to kids? Because in some cases, those two things end up being in conflict. And so I think that what is your job as a school committee? It's to say, what are the values of Pioneer Regional? Is your value that we really want to make sure that as many kids as possible go to school close to home? Or is it, or is it, that we want to make sure that kids have access to X, Y, and Z, and can we only provide that if they're more consolidated? And I'm not answering that question, but I'm telling you that is the way that those conversations have tended to happen in districts that have had those conversations. So that you as a committee then say, this is our priority. So, Egremont is keeping a one-room schoolroom open because it is a priority for the town of Egremont, and they have persuaded their district to say, we want to have K-1 in our community. Even if that means that they only have, single digits numbers of kids, and they thus aren't going to have access to particular kinds of things until they're in higher grades. Other districts have said, if the kids have to stay on the bus a little longer and they have to go a little farther, but they get access to an art room or a music room or better playground equipment or whatever, we think that's more valuable. So that would be how I would say that those two things align, because ultimately it's not really goals, it's really values. What you as a committee value the highest or feel are the community's values can send some of that direction, and then obviously that ends up impacting the budget directly.
I will say,
Yep.
real quick, I will say in the administration meetings that are happening now, those conversations are happening. What do the school's needs look like? What are priorities? And John and I have asked the principals to start making those lists and putting stuff in priority level, so when we get together after end of year and reporting and stuff is done, that we can start filtering through those. So those conversations have started. So that piece of the budget, if you want to call it that, has actually started happening in the administration meetings that we're having.
I just want to make sure we get back to quarterly reports and budgetary oversight by the committee.
Yep, and this slide actually should have been right after quarterly reports, because this is what I would say quarterly reports are. I slid audits in the wrong place. At a baseline, what you should be hearing is first of all a reminder of what it was that you passed for the budget. And this isn't just your general fund. This is, we said we were spending X amount on X. in whatever way it is that you as a committee and administration have decided to do that. So we spend X amount on teachers, or we spend X amount on elementary teachers.
Can I
those
just
kinds of
stop you
things.
right there, because
Yes.
I think this is where I have a big question, right?
Sure.
When we go through the budget process, we look at the whole thing.
Yep,
Ultimately, we vote a bottom line number.
okay.
But then I believe it's my job to watch how that bottom line number is spent.
Yeah,
over
you
the
actually
course
have
of the
voted
year.
that, whether you've done it explicitly. So some committees will actually raise their hand 14 times or whatever. I did in
Okay.
Worcester, right? We would vote 20 or whatever accounts or whatever it was. Plus you vote the grants. Some committees just vote the bottom line, but you have deliberated the accounts.
Yes.
Some committees choose to specifically say in their policy, we have passed the accounts. It is clear from DOR rulings that you have regardless.
We are responsible for
Because
how
you
those
are
accounts
responsible,
spent.
exactly, because you actually have transfer responsibility. There's actually been
Okay,
rulings going back to 93.
So money is not supposed to move from account to account.
Right, in
without
most,
us approving.
so I like to talk here about cost centers, because
Yeah.
accounts are smaller breakdowns. But whatever the cost centers are that you have deliberated, so in some districts they do that by school, in some districts they do that by, we're spending X on utilities
Right.
and X on that. But whatever those are, if the administration needs to move money from one cost center to another cost center, they need to come back to the school committee.
It has to be brought before the committee, and we
Yes.
know where the money's moving and why.
Yes,
Okay,
Shouldn't
that has
just be-
not happened
Yeah.
there you
on
go.
this committee.
It is
And
now.
that is part of how we got into so much
Yeah, but
hot water.
And we
So
can
the
add-
quarterly, so this is actually, a good place to do that is actually the quarterly reporting.
Yes.
If it needs to have more often than, it needs to have more often than, but at a minimum, in most cases, you're not gonna need to move money first quarter, because you're still pretty close to the beginning of the year. By the time you're getting into second and third quarter though, that's when by third quarter in particular, you're looking at the end of the year. But second quarter is when you start to have stuff happen. I mean, again, it's Massachusetts, we have snowstorms, we have, things start to leak, that kind of stuff. But that, yes, if the administration needs to transfer money from one cost center to another cost center, that requires the vote of a school committee.
Okay. I was in a school committee meeting last spring where we were trying to figure out what the heck was happening with our finances. And so one of the principals said to me, well, this is how we do it. So, I look at my budget for my school, and if I see that I have, $6,000 in a fuel line and I know I'm not gonna need it for that, I can move it to here and I can spend it on that. And I said, well, but we're supposed to be making those decisions together.
So there are districts that actually do building-based budgeting.
We don't.
In
No.
most cases though, moving it from utilities, because it's Massachusetts, like you
Right.
screw up your oil line
Right.
and you've got kids who are freezing in April. So,
Right.
in most cases it doesn't involve that. But there are, whatever your cost centers are, there's always going to be somebody who has some degree of discretion, right? Because you're not micromanaging, we're gonna buy pens versus
Absolutely.
pencils.
I have no interest in
But,
micromanaging.
and when it comes to cost centers, like we have, had something catastrophic happen, or even not catastrophic happen, but we've got openings in particular departments and we're moving money over here. Yes, that is something that should be happening at the school committee level,
Okay.
absolutely.
With school
Thank you.
committee approval.
With school committee approval, you need to vote.
Yeah.
If you have, as you were talking about, a budget subcommittee, in many cases, the report is gonna happen there. The recommendations are gonna be coming out of that subcommittee to go to the full committee. You talk about how you have long meetings. In many cases, the kind of deliberation over why are the choices being made are gonna happen in a subcommittee rather than the full committee. But all of the committees should have access to whatever the backup was. And of course, anyone can go to a subcommittee meeting as a member of the public. But yes, absolutely, and then the recommendation would come here and you would vote that you're moving money from X cost center to Y cost center.
Okay, so last summer, we knew we had a problem. We knew we had a transportation huge misstep. We had other things come up. And I said, well, we need to get to work.
Yep,
And so the superintendent said, no. I will work on what are recommended changes with the administration. That's not your job.
the
And so-
recommendation, right, so the recommendation should come from the administration.
So then she said,
Okay.
then we will go to the budget subcommittee, and that's where some decisions will get clarified, and then it will come back to you. and it never did.
Okay.
Committee.
Didn't happen.
Well, and
Okay.
that's why ultimately the school committee evaluates the superintendent too.
Okay, all right, but that is how it is supposed to happen. So
Yes.
when the school committee knows there are concerns, and the superintendent says, okay, I will meet with the administration, we will meet in a budget subcommittee, and we will get back to you,
Mhm.
that needs to happen,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
That's an expected, appropriate expectation.
Yes, and that not only falls under, I mean, you have the evaluation document passing around, not only falls under fiduciary responsibility, but there's other kinds of things that falls under as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And
So what the
remember-
superintendent said though was, I'm gonna freeze budgets and we're gonna make up for this revenue mistake of overstatement by cutting, and when it appears that everything's gone through the wash, we almost broke even in the general fund. We lost $26,000 and not $500,000. So we didn't follow the process, but let's move on, because I came to hear about budgeting.
Well, you're the one making the comment.
So one of the things that is useful to keep in mind is that there are two kinds of costs though. There is the budgetary cost, which may work out, but there's also the level of the level of trust the community has in decision making, and that is a harder thing to keep in mind, or it's a harder thing to measure. It doesn't go on the end of your report, but that's something that, again, it kind of goes back to that transparency thing again, which is even if it all comes out even, and that's great, because I mean long term the money matters, you also need a town meeting that's going to vote your money next year and those kinds of things. So trying to balance those.
Which is why I don't think the schedule should be, something that's just the administration. 4
in
years
terms of
in,
the
I learned
calendar?
about a schedule. I've been
Sure.
working with the principal. I've learned a whole bunch. I've
Mhm.
learned like the root of our problem.
Okay. Yeah, so,
You know.
and that also, again, to your point, is helpful in terms of the towns having an idea of when particular things are going to happen, so that if there is interest among various groups of people, they can actually be hearing about updates as they happen. And I would make the same recommendation around quarterly reporting, because, if there are concerns, people can know where things are and where things
Thank
are
you.
happening.
It's clarifying.
Of course. So this is really, honestly, more or less what a quarterly report should be able to answer, which is the reminder of where the budget you passed was, how much has actually been expended so far, again by cost center. Where does that put you compared to the year end? So if what do you have left? And then also, and this is really the part that gets into the skill of the business office, what expenses are projected to change? Okay, so this is that we know that we're going to spend more money on oil during January, February, March, and maybe April. That account is going to go up. We know that we've got a teacher who's going out on maternity leave. We're going to have a long-term sub, so that changes the salary account. Those kinds of things are going to make a difference. And those are the kinds of things you need to have in the quarterly report, so that you can, certainly that you can make good decisions, but also so that you have an idea of where you're heading. And that also then should also give you a better situation as you're heading into the next year.
So every 4 months, basically?
Every 4 months, basically, yes. Yes, and how you choose to do that, I mean, obviously the fiscal year has quarters, but how you choose to do that, sometimes the first quarter comes in a little late because you want to make sure you've actually got everybody into the cycle, and you've actually got everybody back to school and that kind of thing. Sometimes the fourth quarter gets a little shaky just because there's other reports that need to be happening from the school administration, but more or less, yes, checking. Yep.
Excuse me, isn't quarterly every 3 months?
Because of,
3 months, yes.
Yeah, but
But
July,
it's going
like,
to,
nothing's really
yes,
going on. Do you know
and
what
that's why I
mean?
say you could also even attach it to particular dates. Think about the school year cycle too, though, at the same time.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
So I mean,
So by
the
October,
administration is starting the fiscal year July 1, but how
But
much
we have a
is
lot of
happening
weird
July 1 and
expenses.
on?
We need to be looking at it all the time. And we've got
Mhm.
these lumpy expenses like health insurance that come at us in the first days of the
Mhm.
fiscal year. There's quarter,
maybe every
I mean,
3 months,
the reason
yeah.
to not do it monthly is it doesn't happen, it's too much work. That would be better. Having the analysis
Although that
every
gets
month.
bumpier too, because you end up with, that's one where you can actually almost end up with people panicking because the changes are too dramatic. To your point even about health insurance. But yeah, and that's one where you then can have the conversation, you will probably already know this, of are we where we would expect to be? So, we always spend X amount by this date, and some accounts were spending 30% by this date, but others were spending 70%. The teacher account is going to be virtually expended by year's end,
Right.
even though the fiscal year is not over yet. Yep.
So one of the things coming from the town side of things, and I don't know if they do this in Warwick where Dave's the coordinator or not, but in my prior town, we would produce a warrant schedule with where you should be percentage-wise throughout the year, which I plan to do. And then when there's those outliers like health insurance or things that you pay ahead of time, we pay, our district tech budget might be 95% spent on September 1st because we've paid all our renewals. Those are the types of things that I would then discuss, like why we're not 25%, but we're 70%. So those reports actually will start coming out, I would think, monthly, but if you recommend it quarterly, then that's fine too. But what happens now is they get a report and we encumber what we know we're going to spend or what our contracted is. But one of the things that the school committee has been missing is this: where are we really? We might have 200,000 encumbered for something, but that might not cover it all. So if we've spent 75% of our utilities by January 1st, and that's in a report, then we know, hey, we need to start looking at doing transfers. So that's a huge piece that they haven't got in the past.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because there are places where encumbrance is regarded as almost a religion.
Yeah, it doesn't.
And it can really get you trapped.
It's not a good management
exactly
tool.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
I'm chair of the school committee. I'm sorry to have gotten here late.
I'm glad you're here.
I was being a cow at the Big E doing dairy promotion.
Oh,
so
marvelous!
I apologize.
In the dairy building?
In the Massachusetts building.
Oh, lovely.
There's a woman behind you who keeps raising her hand.
Oh, I'm
and
so
she will
sorry.
be- well, you
If
don't
only I
have
had eyes in the back of my
your
head.
And she will be, she's a candidate for election of a new school board member.
Yes.
So I'm sure she has some questions that would be pertinent to ask.
I'm sorry.
If you could do that, Martha.
I remember one.
Okay. I kept
Well,
seeing your hand go up. And
that's why I said at the end, and this goes for those of you behind me too, is my contact information. So if you remember them tomorrow, send me an email.
So this is something that I've been pondering for the school committee in general, is, we're at a crossroads. We've had a very traumatic thing happen to us with not a lot of oversight and not a lot of checks and balances within the administrative system to keep us on a straight course and give us factual information. It was very traumatic for the school, for the community, for people on the committee, and caused a lot of divisions. And so in lieu of not forgetting that and how that impacted people, thinking about is the school committee thinking about what are the foundational values that we want to hang on to and that we want to move forward with? Because that determines, to my way of looking at things, everything the budget does and the school committee does. Even if you have to moderate how you would ideally like to have something done, because we are in a situation now where the state is watching, where we don't have as much money as we should, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wondered, is there discussion on the school committee about those kind of values and those kind of hopes and expectations? Like, we have a mission statement, and how is this mission statement being supported by the values that we want to have the students receiving? And what we're doing is not a product. What we're doing is a service and of educating the children. And so I just wondered if that was a discussion. That was a little earlier in your
Sure, of course it was.
presentation.
It has to do with goals and priorities.
Should, really inform the budget process, not
Yeah.
just the oil bill.
Yeah.
That's the,
Well, that too, right, exactly.
And I think those are definitely conversations that are going to be had between the superintendent, the principals, the department heads, and myself, because I need to understand the mission and values as I'm sitting with these principals, and they tell me they need X, Y, and Z, and I'd like this, but those are the questions that will be asked. What does this support?
It's a bigger question,
Yeah.
because every single
And where are we
department
going?
gal has sections of it that impact the community, that impact the high school, that, it's really the foundation. And if that is not an agreed upon course, then everything else is in disunity.
Well, and this gets back to what you were saying earlier in terms of goal setting for the superintendent.
Yeah,
So
and
those are, those are tied, which is that you can set goals for the district and set a vision for the district, and then from that should come the superintendent's goals,
Yeah.
and then the rest of this should follow from there. So you're right that in terms of where should the conversation be happening, it's absolutely a conversation, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because too often principal conversations devolve into stuff and dollars rather than direction. But it's absolutely a conversation that this table needs to be having with the administration as well. And to the point that several of you have made, keeping in mind the reality of the situation that you're in, and how that may impact the kinds of choices you can make about your priorities and values. Yep. So this is actually intended kind of as a visualization of exactly that, which is that budgets aren't just, we tend to think of budgets as lists of numbers, and instead budgets should actually be a map that we're starting here and we're going here. And that sounds as if I'm, being metaphorical, but what you have in front of you when you do your budget and what you talk about when you do your budget should not just devolve to numbers of kids in the classrooms or number of teachers you have or those kinds of things. It should be about this kind of thing, which is what are our priorities for the district and how is this budget meeting them, or how is this budget not able to meet them and what are we doing about that? And that can obviously go in a bunch of different directions in terms of what the school committee decides to do. But that having, do you actually make the list of what we didn't do last year and would want to do this year, so that that actually is then brought to the table. But then larger questions around community schools and what you can bring to different kinds of kids and technology, all those kinds of things should be part of that too. So this is really going back to what do you expect in your budget, and this can be about what's in your budget document, but this should also be what your budget discussion is about. Budgets obviously need to support your district goals and be in support of the direction that you intend the district to go in. It should track the changes in spending from year to year. This is actually one of my frustrations when I look at budgets that are just spreadsheets. To your point, like we laid off 10 teachers last year. So if I just see its salary line, I can tell you if it's maybe up or down from last year, but I don't know how much of that has to do with staffing and how much of that has to do with your contract. If instead it says, here's how many teachers we used to have, here's how many we do have, and where they are, that's really more meaningful information, not just for me, but for your community. And that in general across the board is useful. Yes?
Do other districts share with their school committees sort of a district map of personnel and who's where and how things?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
How districts choose to do it depends. So it may be something that comes out in the budget as even if you don't pass a school by school budget, it may say this school has this number of teachers, here's where they are, and it also is a school that happens to spend this much in heat, this much in electricity, and that kind of thing, because that can be useful to know, particularly when you start getting into capital expenses and that kind of thing. But then yes, that can be useful when you're looking forward and backwards.
Yeah, just seeing how things change over time, and
yes,
and that'll be built into the budget book that will be done, because we actually just went through this process as we revised the budget. So from, we'll say July till now, of why are we changing, what are our staff changes, why did we change these staff, how did we save this money? Well, we hired someone that was an M1 versus an M15, so now we have this to reallocate, those types of things, and keeping track of that. So I think that revision process is actually going to be a very good tool when we look at building the FY20 budget also, because we're going to see what we changed from FY19 to, where we're going.
Good. Yeah.
So what Sue's looking for is actually one of the aspects of the comprehensive budget. One of the looks is from a per pupil to class, and the other is the utilization of staff. So those two sides to that.
I just like to understand our organization as a whole. I need a schema that shows me where our assets are.
Well, right, and when I read your news coverage, I can tell you how many elementary school kids you have in each of the buildings, because that always comes up, but that doesn't necessarily tell me how many teachers you have in the buildings.
Right, how we're configuring things and what decisions we're making about that.
Very valuable information.
And I think one of the things that I took away from yesterday when Tracy talked was not necessarily always presenting things in an Excel spreadsheet. So maybe instead of presenting you guys an Excel spreadsheet that has NES, BES, WCS, here's the people that work there, this is their salaries, having almost like a chart or whatever that says, here's your school, these are your grades, these are your teachers, and within those grades, okay, we have XYZ or Mrs. XYZ as your kindergarten teacher. Who are the instructional aides in those classes? How many kids are in each of those classes?
Yes,
Right.
that's what I've wanted
So
forever.
that was a huge
That'd be
takeaway
quite a
from
budget.
yesterday.
That would be great.
And there's no reason why each
Because
principal
that's what
couldn't do
budgets
that.
are. Budgets are a representation of the resources you're investing
right.
in various places. It's
There are
sort
some
of
good
where you're
models of
putting your
infographics.
energy.
that are
Yeah,
out
so
there.
I think being able to learn how to best communicate those things to the school committee in different
Good
forms
job,
than just a spreadsheet. That was a huge takeaway from yesterday's presentation, because I think visuals are better for people
Yeah.
that don't look at numbers every day.
Yeah.
And we as accountants, that's how we think, eat, breathe, sleep. So that'll be something that I'll be working on through the year, is kind of really figuring out what is the best way to get you information, and how do you guys, absorb that information better than just the spreadsheets that
Which
we
leads
provide.
very nicely into the next point, which is that in some cases it's going to be narration.
Yeah.
So some people do better with words.
Yeah.
So I won't belabor that, but that is exactly why that's there. The clarifying projection and basis is really making the same point that we talked about in terms of the quarterly report, which is, what are we basing our numbers on for health insurance, for transportation costs, for those kinds of things. And again, it isn't that we're expecting the administration to have a crystal ball. It's better though if everybody knows where the numbers are coming from, and that way if something does change, then everybody is in a much better place to deal with it than it being a surprise that, how come that number didn't work out? Well, it's because this thing changed. And then again, this is that notion that your documentation isn't just for you. It is for the larger community. So I always feel like I have an easier time making this case in districts where town meetings vote for things. A little harder to make the case in cities, but the community should be able to use your budget in their decision making. So they should be able to have that information as they're planning for their town budget, and as they're talking about what the town is going to need for their capital expenses and those kinds of things. And also then it helps them to make decisions about moving forward with the district. Yep.
Just a quick question. So we have very responsible town financial planners and observers. They like, spreadsheets.
Yes.
But is it your experience that in front of a town meeting, having the representation of the financial information in a pie chart or in a graph or in some other kind of visual model is easier for everybody else in the world?
Yeah, so I would never deprive the town.
And it might be more persuasive and
Right.
motivational.
And at the end of the day, even if the town financial people live in the town, they still only get one vote. So I would never fight a financial person to take away their spreadsheets. I know too many of them too well, but I would say that yes, to the point that several of you have already made, that isn't the universe that most people live in on their day-to-day basis. And as Tanya knows, one of the points that I made yesterday is there's a good number of Americans that suffer from math anxiety. So as soon as you start to put that kind of stuff up there, people start to freak out internally.
They panic.
Which is not the place that you want people at when they're going to vote for your school budget. So the more you can put information in ways that keeps people within their comfort zone. And this is also one where sometimes we talk about who is it that's doing the budget presentation? How comfortable are they in front of the group? How comfortable are they taking questions? Because that's another place where having someone who can effectively tell your story, tell the story of the district, talk about the values, talk about the decisions that you're making, not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of what it means for kids and those kinds of things, can be really useful. So when you're talking about your budget presentation, you're right, absolutely think of it in terms of the visuals, but also think of it in terms of really the whole package of who is it that gets up, who takes the questions. I mean, one of the things that can be really important is Are you presenting as a unified front? The district where it's only the superintendent and, you know, the chair of the school committee maybe isn't even there, or that, you know, do you have a budget person who is part of the presentation? How comfortable are those kinds of people? And I'm not saying that everybody needs to talk, but there can be different kinds of messages depending on the choices that you make there. So that's something that's important to keep in mind.
One of the things that we did in a Town 2 presentation, and I think it would be more beneficial, especially talking about like the school's goals and where we want our spending to fall, is having the charts and what percentage are we spending on staff, what are we spending on athletics, what are we spending on the visual and performing arts, because I know those are huge things that the communities are concerned about. So, you know, yes, we now have a $14,220,000 budget, but I think knowing, maybe presenting to the communities, okay, this is what percentages we were at in 19 when we're looking at 20, and this is what our shift is, and those kind of things. So it takes time to put those together.
Yes, it does.
But this is really great, because I think it, you know, allows me to understand what the school committees need to communicate and also what the communities are looking for, because that transparency to the communities, they just see a number and what they're going to get assessed at, not necessarily how is this helping our kids.
And it's a hard truth to the point that's already been made, but every school district in the state, the majority of spending is on salaries. We're a people-centered business. That's what we do. And so that when there are cuts that have to be made, inevitably comes out of personnel. But I think that I have yet to meet a appropriating authority that has a good grasp of how little discretionary funding there is within a school budget. So the more that you can illustrate that, the more useful that you'll be. So this is the same slide you already saw, but is intended to bring you back around to this being what you are about and what your job is, with the centerpiece of it being the budget that then, as we talked about, stems into the other two pieces. There are, and I put together a cheat sheet, a number of places in the MGL, which you have the whole book for now, but these are the MGLs that specifically have to do with budgeting.
Oh, great.
Okay,
Great.
so I'm going to pass that pile around. How many of you are behind me? 3?
4, 5.
Okay, so I hope I brought enough. If not, I can send you it as a document. But that's sort of the cheat sheet that says, you know, essentially why are we doing what we're doing. There are other places in the MGL, as you'll see, that have to do with things like, why do we pass school lunch this year? Why do we have to make other kinds of decisions here? Those aren't included, but this is the sort of the big ones, which are, some are in 71, some are in 41. There are a couple places they are in the budget.
Great.
And then this has my information on it.
That was the left.
So, and if it's too small to read, I also have business cards which I can give you instead. My email is on here. That is my cell phone number, and that's my Twitter handle for those of you who are more social media intended. You can use any of them. Okay, our cell phone number is intended to be for school committee consumption.
Okay.
If any of you are squinting.
I'm at a wrong angle and I can't read
Okay.
it.
She'll give you her card.
got
It's
cards.
Yes.
easier to read.
Okay, that would be great.
But let
And
me
it is on
also
the
then
other
ask
side.
what other questions you might still have.
Oh, I see it, okay.
I should
So
be sitting sideways.
one of the things that I was asking
pick
for
one.
in the past and never got was a comprehensive budget, like an overall look at all the revenue sources, all of the expense lines, sort of the whole picture. Should I expect that type of thing in a quarterly report?
No.
Okay.
I'm also thinking that you should, I know we've talked a little bit earlier about the joint committee. I'm thinking you should send Tanya down specifically for the session I'm doing, I think it's on Thursday, on budgeting best practices in terms of presentation. One of the things I wanted to caution you about actually is you're hearing like all kinds of things that you're going to get, and that's fantastic, and I'm really glad those are your priorities. Please realize that I don't know how many people are in your office, but she only has so many hours in a day, and she has to still keep making sure your bills are paid.
Right.
And she's going to have, you know, an outside person she has to be giving information to too. So I enthusiastically endorse everything that you're saying, but do realize that some of these things are going to happen in steps. So is it probably, I don't want to say easy enough, is it a potential first step to say, how much money do we get in federal grants versus regional transportation reimbursement versus we're getting from the towns versus this? Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty straightforward pie chart for you to get. The kind of conversation around how many different kinds of staff do we have in different kinds of buildings. That probably is something that it sounds like it's actually kind of almost already done and just needs to be put in a situation. But I wouldn't expect everything even this year. But you have laid out priorities and goals here. You know, nobody's voting them, but it's clear that the priorities of the committee are shared by the administration in terms of this, so that you're all on the same page. And it sounds to me as though that's going to continue with, you know, the people that are behind me. So you're already in a good place there. And part of it is going to be just sorting out, you can't do everything at once, right? You don't want to bite off more than you can chew. And honestly, I'm thinking more from a business office sense than anything else here. What are the things that are most important for the community to have going forward? And obviously, a lot of that's going to have to do with transparency, some of it, and I can see where having transparency around staffing in schools is going to have to be a community conversation anyway. But those kinds of what do we need to do, you know, this month versus what do we need to do next year is probably part of that.
And I think working too with the consultants that are working for the Heart Committee too, because we don't want to double do the work. And I think that like that chart that I'm talking about the staff and how many students are in each class and those kind of things, those might be things that they're looking at. So some of the information and data may already be collected and just need to be put in different forms.
Yes.
But I've worked with Mark Abrams for years, so him and I have been talking and whatever, so you know, we can try to see what we can get from them to you know, provide that information, present it and whatnot. But as far as like the comprehensive, like you're talking about the revenue and expenditures together, when I had to send out the new budget to the towns based on the ruling or whatever, that actually was consolidated, and so I kind of have that in a nice neat little, so where the revenues is page 1 and then all your expenditures kind of follow, so it's in one document. It doesn't have percentages, but it does have that all together now. So that can be done. But,
Thank you.
and I will just say, like, if there's any particular goals and stuff of the school committee and how they want things presented, what is the best way to go about having those conversations? Do you have them in a school committee meeting? Do I take thousands of emails, so to speak, and recommendations?
You don't take thousands of emails.
What would your recommendation be on filtering those things and prioritizing? Because obviously in the situation I'm in, like you said, these things aren't going to be done overnight. They're steps. Like my biggest priorities right now are, one, before I can even create a new budget, creating a compliant chart of accounts.
Yes.
Because that's been in our management letter as far back as I can see. So, creating that chart of accounts, creating the new budget spreadsheet or budget books or whatever you want to call it. What is your best advice on how to take those concerns in and how to prioritize them?
I think that can be a good conversation for you to be having with your budget subcommittee.
Okay.
Because that's a good place for you to say, look, here are the things I absolutely have to do, right? Like, we've been having audit findings on our chart of accounts for years. I have to do that. Here are things that already have happened that I can easily share with you without that being a lot more. Given that information, what do you as the budget subcommittee see as remaining high priorities, and then have it as a discussion. And then, that's something where you can actually have the back and forth and say, okay, so that's not something I'm going to be able to get to this year, or that's something we can probably do by the time we get to town meeting. And I would say to the committee, channeling those concerns through your subcommittee, actually, have the subcommittee make that part of their work, would be a good use of the subcommittee as that a place that you can then have that conversation with them directly. And then if any of it rises to the level of being a superintendent goal or a district goal, what are the district goals this year is to have a more transparent budget or those kinds of things. That does happen sometimes. That obviously is a conversation for the full committee, but that may be something that you want to consider as well.
Okay, so we will know what our line items are. We will know when we need to transfer.
Right,
And we will
talk about
have
cost
quarterly
centers though.
reports.
We wanna talk
Yes.
about cost centers.
Yep.
Cause we don't wanna have people
Yep.
freaking out that, you know, they need to come back to you because they've decided to.
No,
I
no,
can't
no,
come up with a good example.
yeah, I don't wanna
but
be
they're not-
unreasonable.
Well,
Yeah.
and one of the things I did say, because of the situation we're in, I wanna provide even more transparency than we might be required. So, for example, you know, we need to transfer $1,000 from one line to the next because it was just misallocated in salaries or something. I think that's something, you know, obviously it's within a certain cost center, so it can be done, but I would like to present that and say, okay, these are the transfers that have been done within the cost centers, and then these are the transfers I need you to vote on.
And that, right, and that again, I think is a good.
Rather than voting on
Yes.
everyone?
Right, no, you're right.
Okay.
Right, we've just, I mean, however you've established the cost centers, you know, I give ridiculous examples, like we've decided to hire a Spanish teacher instead of a French teacher.
Yeah.
That's, I hope is gonna be within the same cost center, right?
Right.
I don't think it's probably even gonna be coming out of a different line item, honestly, but there's your
Right.
extreme example.
Yep.
That's the kind of conversation you have at your quarterly meeting, of you should be aware, these are changes that have already
Okay.
happened, you do not need to vote them. But you should be aware that these are things that we
Because
did.
they did
those are gonna
recommend us
also-
voting line by line this year, but I think, you know, if we stick to the cost center voting and then the quarterly, these are the transfers that have been done within certain cost centers, because these are the things that are happening. Because I think it's important that the school committee understands what's going on behind the walls so that they
Yes.
can project what they might be presented with the next year.
And you might even think about that in terms of your presentation, right? You
Okay.
bolded the cost centers and the line items are underneath it. You're voting the bold lines, you know, those kinds of things. And that may be helpful to the visual thinkers.
Thank you.
Anything else? All right, well, if you go home tonight or, you know, wake up tomorrow morning, and this goes for all of you,
Open
and
them
you
both.
realize that you have unanswered questions, please get in touch. There are presentations we do around
need to get this
transparency
to her.
budgeting, those kinds of things. Some of that we would do anyway, so consider it. But yes, absolutely, we are here. That is what we are for. Please make sure that you're availing yourself of that as necessary.
All right,
Thank you so much for coming,
And have a
Tracy.
safe drive home.
Oh, thank you.
Susan Fisher, shoot her an email.
We appreciate you big time.
Oh, okay.